Welcome to the Tag Talks podcast. Today I'm joined by Coach Ryan Banta. Coach, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Thank you so much for coming on. Let just get us started and let everyone know a little bit about yourself. Where you're from, where you're working, what kind of positions you hold.
So I'm a high school track and field coach in the United States in the St. Louis metro area. It's a community called Chesterfield, which is an affluent area in the St. Louis metro area. And we have a lot of diversity, people from all around the world, a lot of doctors, lawyers, and engineers that work with Boeing. And so it's an interesting mix of people to work with. And I've been coaching at Parkway Central, which is also the high school I went to, for about 19 seasons now. So I'm getting close to 2 decades being at the same place. So pretty dedicated to that community, and definitely a school that has some interesting opportunities, but also has never been truly a athletic powerhouse per se. And so I always say our programs that are successful at our school have really done a great job to overachieve and to dial in all the perfect things that you can for the makeup of your team and your programs. So it's been a good place to teach, which I've been teaching there for 15 years and coaching there for 19. But it took me a while to get my certification to teach, and thankfully they hired me. But it's been a great experience, a wonderful place to work, great colleagues, great community. And it's one of those things where you wake up every day, you're excited to make a difference, and it's one of the few careers where you actually do have an impact on young people's lives that permanently sets them up for success. And thankfully, we've had the opportunity to do that at my school now for, almost 2 decades, and really proud of my job. And I tell the kids I'm just as excited on day one as they are. I'm ready to go, raring to go, looking forward to it, thinking about my lesson plans, thinking about my workouts. It's just so much fun. And, every day it's a joy. It's the difference between being a job and a career is if you love it, it's a career. If you don't love it, it's just a job. And so Thankfully, I'm in the career category.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Just a random question here that popped into my head. Do you have any second generation athletes? So athletes that you coach their parents, you've been there 19 years now.
Not yet. Not yet. I do have, I am now getting a lot of my friends' kids who I went to high school with. In fact, one of my very best athletes who's currently a rising junior, and we lost our season this year because of COVID, but she was one of the top ranked freshmen in the country. And then this year in indoor track, she was one of the top ranked indoor athletes, all grade levels, in the 60-meter dash. And her dad and I were teammates in high school, and he was a really good guy. And so I'm starting to get some of that going on. I got a couple other buddies of mine where I've coached their kids as well. So that's really fun. And one of those things that's also interesting as an adult and a person that has some influence and power, like how do you handle that relationship with a friend's kid? Because they are your friends, but at the same time, like they have to be held accountable to the same standards of rules and expectations. And so there's this discussion that's now, after kind of going through that process more recently, again, as you evolve as a coach, is it's really important to kind of have that discussion with your friends who are parents of these children to say, look, my role, my relationship is going to be very different when we step into the hallways of my school and onto the track. And I have to carry myself very differently, and I have to relate to you very differently in the time that your sons or daughters are here, because they have to be held to the same standard. I cannot play favorites with this type of stuff. So if they mess up, they're going to be held accountable. I've got to be the coach, even though you're my buddy, and you think you can tell me things and talk to me about stuff. I still am the one who's going to be making those decisions during the regular season. You have to respect my experience to make the right decisions and to not be playing armchair quarterback with everything I do until the season's over. And then when the season's over, if you want to sit down, you want to chat and have a soda or a couple chicken wings, and you want to talk about some stuff with me, that's fine. But during the season, I've got to be in charge. You got to trust me, and you got to back me up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was even for myself personally, that was something I had to try and learn real quickly in my career. I went from being an athlete on a team to pretty much immediately being a coach on that team and coaching all my buddies and my former teammates. And that was definitely something that I struggle with. And as you, like you said, you just kind of grow and evolve over time. And as you cut your teeth in the trenches, you learn new skills and new ways to face problems that are coming up. So
100%.
And like I said, that's so cool that you're still in the area that you kind of grew up in. So now you're coaching your former teammates' kids, and eventually I'm sure you will get some second generation athletes. I thought that would be kind of a cool question and to see if you did have that. But why don't you talk us a little bit about your career as an athlete and how that kind of went through the ranks, and then that transition that eventually one day you had to make when you went from athlete to coach.
So I'm not going to do this whole like I was born in 1978 and but I will give you a brief synopsis, which basically is I was a early mature. So like I've not grown a single inch or millimeter since I was a sixth grader. And
Wow.
So I was a huge kid in sixth grade, 99 percentile, shaving in sixth grade. You know, I got offered lottery tickets when I was like 12, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And I had some physical advantages over a lot of my friends. And so as a freshman in high school, I was on our varsity team. I went to state and did all that kind of stuff. And so I had immediately a big impact and set a couple records for my age group and my age level in Missouri. And so I was like very bitten by the athletic bug early, because athletics actually is what created an opportunity for me to have a positive identity. Until sports really became a thing that I excelled at, I was, you know, I might have had 3 friends in elementary school. I was picked on a lot as a kid, and I was easy to cry. You know, I'm an emotional guy. So, you know, they knew they could get me to do all that kind of stuff. And then through sports, you know, me being able to kind of exert myself onto a situation or a challenge and influence that directly was really attractive. And so I was full bore into athletics, and it became a huge part of my identity, as many people listening to this podcast have gone through similar experiences. But for me, it was just a lifestyle change. Unfortunately, though, as an athlete, I spent a lot of time hurt. I tore my hamstring. I mean, whatever the highest grade hamstring tear you can get, I got. And my friends could hear it pop, you know, when it happened. And that was a really bad experience. And I had never been injured. And I never respected warming up and cooling down. I was the guy that would give you everything on the intervals. You know, I'd give you every bit of myself that I could, but everything around that, I would be flat chat, exhausted, rolling around, you know, booty lock and all that kind of stuff. And the last thing I wanted to do was get up and cool down. And then again, I was always trying to sneak the warm up and deal with that so that I could kind of like not give too much there either, so that I could hang and survive my track and field workouts. And my high school coach is a good guy. He is in the Missouri Hall of Fame for track and field. But, you know, moving forward, there are some things that like I've actually helped influence him with training and stuff based on my own experience, because I was a talented but frustratedly injured athlete. And that was just a huge challenge. And then when I got into college, my college coaches were not very good at all. And they would throw in random workouts and things like that. And so for me, here I had a good high school coach who knew what he's doing. And I was surrounded by guys who were all, you know, all-American high school guys. We had a guy during my time that graduated with me that set the state record in the 400-meter dash. So I knew what good track and field looked like, you know. But then I still was talented, injured, and very opinionated. So that's like the worst combination for a college coach. And I mean, if I could apologize to them face to face, I certainly would. Over time, I've tried to do that in any way that I can for them, because I was like, guys, because they were growing and developing too. They were young coaches. And so for me, I would put together a month or two where I could stay healthy, and some really good things would happen in college. And like we broke a school record for a random indoor relay that's never really run. You know, I was able to make the conference finals as a freshman, so I was all conference as a freshman outdoors in the 100-meter dash, but I could never put an indoor and an outdoor season together. Constantly was getting hurt. And so here I am, frustrated, challenging the coaches, and kind of knowing that some of the stuff we were doing was not right. And so that just made for a really cantankerous relationship. So coming out of college, the last thing I ever thought about doing was being in education and coaching. And I was going to do politics because that's what I got my degree in, was political science. And I had a job offer for one of the most powerful men in Washington. And at the time, they weren't going to pay me very much money. So I couldn't really take the job in Washington and survive. And that's what's so funny when people talk about why are rich people always in politics? Well, it's kind of structured that way. You know, if you're going to live below the poverty level and work in Washington, D.C., that's almost an impossible task to do unless you know someone and you could sleep on their couch. And I was going out there with no connections other than all the stuff that I had accomplished when I was in college, being the student government president and interning with the city of Kenosha and, you know, starting fraternities and doing all this kind of stuff that I did. I accomplished a lot, but I had no national connections. So anyway, I came back to St. Louis, Missouri, and started working in politics locally, got some people elected. Those people I got elected were not great people, but I didn't know that until I went through the campaigning process. And at that point, you're committed. Yeah. But I realized if I'm going to work with these people, my name would be attached to them. And we can see in modern politics, like if you're attached to certain people, you're done.
Yeah.
You know, like your life is ruined. And so I was like, I just don't think I can do this. And the straw that broke the camel's back on that was the fact that one of the guys who was actually a friend who I worked for and got elected, he owed me money and never paid me the full amount of money that he owed me, you know, and made some excuses about where his campaign finances had to go and all that kind of stuff. So now I'm like, shoot, what am I going to do? I've got no career. This is what I wanted to do. And these people I wanted to work for are corrupt. And the people that had me in Washington, D.C., I couldn't live there. I just couldn't afford it. It was just a non-starter because my college cost a lot of money and I had to pay it back. So my mom was always like, you know, Ryan, you'd be a great educator. You'd be a great person in the classroom. You've got a lot of things to offer. And my mom was a great school district in Parkway School District where I teach. She's like the Hall of Fame, Pillar of Parkway, Teacher of the Year nominee for this district, Charter Arts Educator of the Year, all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, Mom, I can't fill those shoes. It's just not going to happen. She's like, Ryan, I think you'd be good at it. You'd be good at it. Please try it. And I'm like, well, my coach in high school, I liked him a lot. And I thought he was a really good and honorable man. Maybe I'll ask to volunteer for him because I felt like my athletic experience, I left a lot on the table because of things that I didn't realize about myself that I needed to do to take care of my body. And the fact that like I felt like my coaching to athlete experience in college was not the way that I wanted it to be. And I'm like, maybe I'll go ask Coach Warren. So sure enough, Coach Warren is in the door. When I walk in, this is before Twitter, Instagram, text messaging, any of this stuff. And we're talking 20 years ago. And sure enough, the first person I see as I walk in the door of the Commons is Coach Warren. And he's sitting at a table with his entire track staff. And of course, he's excited to see me. He's like, what are you doing here? I'm like, well, actually, I came here to see you and was wondering if I could volunteer for you. And he's like, oh, that's what we were talking about. You know, we'd love to have you. So after about 2 weeks of working with Coach Warren, I realized, oh, yeah, my mom was right, just like moms always are.
Yeah.
This is the path I should have chosen in the first place. I should have been a teacher and a coach because every day that I was there for that 2 hours of practice, it was the highlight of my day. I was looking forward to it. I was excited about it. I never felt so fulfilled. I never felt like I mattered more, you know, in my life. And I was like, oh, I've got to go back. I've got to get my teacher certification. This has got to become my career. This is what I was born to do. So that's kind of the process that, I know it's a long story, but kind of where I came to this realization that public education and coaching was the thing that I was born to do and meant to do. And part of my bad experiences with injuries and kind of cutting that potential off at the legs, so to speak, you know, because of my injuries, it left me very hungry to want to provide other athletes the opportunity not to have the negative things that have happened to me happen to them. And I wanted to be somewhat of a firewall between them and injury and lack of reaching their potential. And with the girls program, which is who I coach at Central, there were no good girls sports at Parkway Central, really, of any kind of consistency. Very few all-state athletes, no state championships since like 1985 for the girls teams. And that's not track and field. That was like swimming. And in Missouri, that was like one of only 30 schools that swam. So like that state title wasn't even like a fully like legit title. You know, it's like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like there were so many kids at school that deserved an opportunity to have a coach like Coach Warren, but on the female side. And so that's kind of where I came to taking over that program and basically begging them to give it to me so that I could kind of implement that vision.
No, that's awesome. And I think it's, you know, like you said, that turbulent journey that you kind of had through athletics yourself and, you know, not having a great relationship with your college coaches, but having something to look back and compare that to by having a really great high school coach, you know, that's what's that's what has allowed you, I'm sure, to be a successful coach now yourself, because you have this like complete ends of the spectrum that you've seen, and you think, man, it's totally unfair for these kids that have to be exposed to bad coaching, because you know it's out there. We've all seen it. I played on tons of teams growing up. I had some really good coaches. I had some terrible coaches, and as much as my good coaches have motivated me and fueled me to pursue this as a career, just as much so of the bad coaches that I've had, because I want to try and be someone that, you know, like you said, is that positive experience for those athletes. So
and in fairness to the guys that were there before me, the coaches, that they had a run of about 4 or 5 years where they were starting to build something really great. And then the guy who was the head coach before me got a great job as an administrator where he could like run basically an entire school district on his own. And that last year that he had coached, that was one of the down years that they had out of their 5, you know, so it was kind of a rebuilding year for him. And then I took over the program after that, but still no state titles, no district championships, no district plaques, you know, like the regional championships, none of that stuff. And so, yeah, it was one of those things where it's like, hey, there's some potential here. There's some talent here. Let's just make it fully realized. And thankfully, I had the opportunity to, again, evolve and screw that up a little bit in my first 5 years, and then figure out how to really get this whole thing done and how to put together an entire program, not just, you know, a small window of some talented athletes.
Yeah, like for you in that position, you're you know, asked or placed with the task of trying to shift the culture and really have something that's going to be long standing, so that you don't just have those 4 short years where you get a good talented group of kids that come in and you guys are good for a few years and then you have some down years. When you shift that culture and you make that full 180 flip, that's when you can start to string together successful years, decades, and, you know, and really build a legacy. And that's all from a cultural standpoint.
Correct.
What were your events when you were an athlete yourself, before we kind of start to dive into some of the more granular topics of speed and development? What were your events that you ran, and are you just on the sprint side with your girls, or are you doing some distance stuff as well?
So for me, my athletic experience, I was a tailback in high school, and I participated in the college football team. I was a sprinter, 60 meter, 100, 200. And that's what I thought, that's what I thought I was, because that's what every sprinter wants to be, right? Every sprinter wants to be the top flight 100 meter, 200 meter person. In retrospect, and looking at like my experience and the events I actually was really good at in high school when I wasn't hurt, and then also doing 23andMe and throwing my DNA into DNA Fit and Athletogen and all these sites, lo and behold, I was I was meant to be a 400 meter runner, but, I was trying to be the big bad running back. And, I was like, oh man, when I get to 200 pounds, I'm going to be unstoppable. Well, I got to 200 pounds and never saw that again. I never got below it. Yeah. And probably my best weight was probably around 185 pounds. That would have been my best weight as an athlete. I call it my fighting weight. And so, I ran under 11. I ran in the 22s. So, as a high school guy, that would have been really good. I didn't run those times until college because, again, another mistake. I never invested in off-season training when I was a high school athlete, and I never really lifted weights, even though my dad was a powerlifting champion. Okay. big man. You know, he was 6'2" and 285 pounds and 10% body fat. He was literally a vanilla gorilla. I mean, it was unbelievable, you know, and here I am with those type of genetics, and I never actually put that into place until I got into college. And then I gained not a freshman 15, I gained a freshman 25, you know, and so I was way underpowered, and then got up to, you know, 185 pounds by the end of my freshman year in college. And then I kept, you know, wanting to get bigger and bigger and bigger for football. And that had a detrimental effect on my performance. You know, it's this whole idea of balance and picking your modalities and knowing where the best weight is, your best event. There's so much that goes into this before we even start training. And so that probably would have been, you know, the event would have been the 400-meter dash based on my genes and based on what I think I could have done. Now, when you ask the question about what I coach, I basically have written workouts for most of my career from the 100 all the way up to cross-country 5K. And I'm usually the one writing all of those training plans and those workouts, and that includes the hurdles as well. So, and I've got my level 2 in endurance, along with the sprints, relays, and hurdles. So I've got basically all the flat and turn left events covered. And so I let my field events coaches, they write all their technical workouts and things like that, unless they're a new coach. And then I'll offer up a basic scheme, and I let them kind of slap on the meat and blood of that skeleton as they move forward. So everybody in my program, so like people who don't think I know anything about distance, say I'm a distance guy. People that think I don't know anything about sprints thinks I'm thinks I'm a distance guy, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. Meanwhile, you know, I'm the one who had a guy set a national record in the bench press, and in the same year had a young lady set the national high school record in the 5K. So, you know, I've had a lot of variation of experiences and talent, you know, and that's kind of what speaks to, you said earlier, there's 1,000 ways to skin the cat, which is so true, because every one of these athletes requires from you special attention and special training based on their abilities and genetics.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that 1,000 ways to skin a cat is the perfect segue into kind of the meat and potatoes, so to speak, for today's conversation. That's really talking about speed development. So your book, the Sprinters Compendium, that came out in 2017?
Correct.
Yeah, so it's been out for a few years now. How many different coaches contributed as part of that project?
So not including me, 50 coaches.
50 coaches.
So from around the world, and not all of them were straight up sprint people, because like there are certain things I wanted to target amongst them. And also I purposely wrote the book in a way and created the book in a way to have a bunch of different voices that didn't agree, you know, so that way we could have the high school coaches not be confused, but find someone or something that they could like attach to. So for say like, okay, I'm in Canada. I can't get outside. We don't have a 200-meter track indoors anywhere near me. How do I get this work done? I've got a hallway that's only 50 meters long. I'm not going to be able to run 400 repeats, right? Okay, I'm in Texas. I live in Waco. I'm near Baylor. Clyde Hart's there. They've got a huge indoor track. Okay, that's going to look very different, you know, because now you've got extreme heat, you know, and you've got the hotbed of talent that is Texas. You know, you're getting more ultraviolet rays, which actually has an effect on healthiness and improved sports performance. So like wherever you are, like whether you're a Olympic coach, college coach, high school or youth, that's a thing. Whether you are located in a particular country or part of the world, that's a thing, you know, and what are your resources and financial abilities and things like that in terms of what can you do, what can you pay for? You know, it would be nice for all of us to have a 1080 sprint, but most of us don't have $20,000, you know, sitting around. So how do we get that training done that system provides people, but kind of what I call the redneck version, you know, the hillbilly 1080. How do you do that? And so when we put this book together, that was kind of my goal, is to give people a lot of options and then allow them to explore what they felt most comfortable with or what they felt spoke to them, and then take that in a direction. And then the other part of the thing when I put together was every one of us needs to improve a particular aspect of our game. And so in track and field, you're like, well, what is that in running? Well, there's tons of stuff. And so you might be really good in this area where it comes to holistic medicine, but you're not a biomechanist. So like, how do we figure out that part of it where maybe somebody like myself, when I first started coaching, I was very weak in sports psychology. I needed to figure out actual reasonable, usable things to improve my athletes. And so I went back and got a master's degree, but then I put that into the book because, yeah, you might be great at the X's and O's, but you don't know how to convey it to the athletes. That's important. You know, that communication is a way for you to get better, to evolve as a coach. So that's kind of how we kind of laid that out, because I wanted people to be curious and I wanted them to have a lot of options. So that way something would speak to one of those 50 coaches.
Yeah. And that's what I think is so cool about, just looking at that project and everything that you're able to do with it, is that there are, like you said, there's conflicting viewpoints. There's things that would work differently based on geography and resources and athletes and abilities. And like you said, so I think it's so cool, but really it's just to hammer home that point that, hey, listen, speed is a real thing. And there's a multitude of ways that we can go about developing it. And I think that's one thing that people really need to understand. I get questions from the kids that I train all the time, and, they get attached, and you love them for their genuine curiosity, but they get attached to these ideas of like, what's the best way for me to get faster? What's the best way for me to jump higher? What's the best way for me to get stronger? And you're like, I'm not saying this to rub you the wrong way, but it depends. Right. So I think that's one thing that why I really wanted to talk to you, because you've had this exposure to so many different trains of thoughts, and all these people in all these different camps. And I'm sure as you went through this project, you were able to start to diffuse all of that and say, okay, there are a million different ways we can go about this, but maybe there are some commonalities as well. So with that exposure that you've had to all these different ideas, what were some of the commonalities that really stuck out for you? And what were some of the recommendations that you think just generally in terms of speed development that athletes and coaches should be following?
All right. So number one, the all depends thing is something I 100% live by. And it is a frustrating response to young coaches and athletes, because they want that concrete golden bullet. I want the answer. I want to be able to get this done, and I want the cheat code, the easy cut and paste program. And that is okay early on, because you need some sort of scaffolding, right? You need something that you can then build inside of your own program with your own ideas and stuff. But what I always say is you need to be exposed to the classics, right? So you've got your long to short, short to long. You've got your concurrent system, which is Mike Hurst, it's this Australian sprint coach out in Australia. I kind of feel like I'm that way as well with this thing called the critical mass. You've got the adapt or die, which is Tony Wells, which is very high intensity plyometrics and lifting and short sprints. You've got the short system, which is basically Chris Kortfus and Tony Aller, where they never really go too far away from their aspects of training and things that they're doing. And then you've got what I call a flow state coach. And so a flow state coach is somebody who basically takes all of these systems because they're a master of the classics. It's like, look, if you want to be a carpenter, a hammer is a good tool, but you also have to be good with a saw. You also have to be good with, measurements, right? You also have to be good with the ability to varnish and paint and do all these kind of things. And so a master carpenter isn't just good at one of those things. They're good at all of them, right? So what's the commonality that I've found? Number one commonality is that training has consequences. Whatever those philosophies you adhere to that I just listed off for you will have a radical impact on what type of athlete you will produce. So, for example, if you're a short-to-short guy like Kortfus and Tony Holler, you're going to produce very fast, explosive 100-meter people, maybe 200-meter people, depending on their genetics, and then long jump people, right, or jumpers. Like that system works really good for that. That system can work good for field sports like football, where you have lots of downtime and then all-out efforts. Probably not good for soccer. In fact, not at all good for soccer, okay? And we can get into that as well, you know, and people will be mad at me. They're like, well, if you improve your absolute maximum speed, you know, then running at sub-speed, you know, you've got speed. Yeah, I get it. But the reality is that that's just one component of particular fitness towards soccer, right? If you want to be a good 400, 200 meter person, you're going to have to run a little bit over 200, a little bit under it, if you're going to run the 2. And the same thing for the 400. You're going to have to run 350s and 450s, and your training has to look like that. Your race modeling has to look like that. And if you're not doing things that are built around the demands of your sport, you're going to fail to get the best from your athletes if you're not training that way, you know? And so that's the funny thing. Training has consequences. If you're a big plyometric person and you're doing a lot of that stuff, your athletes are going to be able to jump. And probably the athletes you produce are probably going to be elastic, you know, posterior chain, hamstring-centric athletes, right? If that's all you're doing. But if you don't spend any time doing anything else, then they're probably not going to be as good, maybe coming out of the blocks. They might not be as good at some other aspects of the sport, you know, because you're not training them towards that, you know. Now, the other part of it is, what I found is, a lot of times the means of the competition drive your choices. So for Tony, who's a short-to-short guy, feed the cats guy, the 400-meter dash is a secondary event. The 4x2 is right before the 400. You're not going to do those back-to-back. And then the 200-meter dash is right before the 4x4. So literally your 400-meter athletes, your long sprinters, are never going to be the same people unless you force it. And then that becomes dangerous. The other thing is if you don't train your athletes for whatever that competition is going to look like, they're not going to be successful in handling it. So if you have a championship situation where your sprinter has to run 3 or 4 or 5 races over the course of a couple days, and they've never seen that in a previous competition, because remember, competitions are training too. It isn't necessarily that you have to do it all the time in practice. But if it's never been seen before in competition, and then at the end, where it matters the most, the first time they've ever seen it is when they're doing it, that's problematic. So like my mentor, who I talked about, Steve Warren, one of the things I've really kind of pressed on him to change, I mean, he's been coaching for 40 plus years, is that he doesn't like to race on Saturdays. He likes to have his family time, and I understand that. You know, my wife is like a single mother, you know, 6 months worth of Saturdays out of the year because of my coaching. And I'm so blessed to have a great wife. But, you know, if you want them to be ready for a state championship in track in Missouri, which is a Friday, Saturday, right? And they have to run prelims and everything to get to the finals. And we're talking about a sprinter. That means in a state championship over the course of 2 days, they could run 8 times. That's brutal.
Yeah.
That's brutal. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do that, because at some point you might have diminishing returns. But if that's a choice you're making, and that's a choice the athlete also wants to do, and you guys have come to this conclusion, and they've never seen 2 days in a row of practice where they're going hard, right? And they've never seen intervals that are kind of around the intervals that they're going to run in competition, you cannot expect that they're going to be successful. So right there, that's why when we talk about the USATF folks in America, where they talk about training backwards, that's one of the things they teach every track coach. The backwards training serves 2 roles. One is like it informs you on this last competition is the goal. Mm-hmm. And because this is the goal, that informs you on what you should do. And then once you know what the goal is, in terms of just the what it's going to look like, the competition, then you set up your planning backwards from that, and then you don't have to include stuff in your planning that you're never going to get to. Yeah. Because you got 2 months, you got 3 months, you don't need to be doing long running and lots of tempo. It serves you no purpose, you know. But if you've got more time, then that might be something you add in, because you don't want the athlete to become docile. You don't want them to plateau, and you don't want them to get diminishing returns. But if your season isn't that long and you've got this small competitive cycle, well, then you don't even need to worry about that. Do the best bang for the buck stuff and get the most out of that. Mm-hmm. So the book itself, and I know I'm going on and on here, but that's the idea that I found being the most common. The choices that everyone makes is based around the events that they most like to coach or have had the most success in. And then what does their championship competitive cycle look like? And that's where you get to the all depends as the biggest one, right? The biggest all depends is, what is the event that you're trying to get your best performance at? What does it look like? And then the second part is, okay, this is the necessary key performance indicators, KPIs, that you need to have to be the most successful in these events. And if you don't train in an area, which is the whole premise of my critical mass system, you're not going to be very good at that particular thing. So a lot of times when people ask me about, well, who do you vibe with the most? Which coach do you vibe with? You know, from the 50 that wrote in your book. And I say, well, it all depends. Yeah. And people are like, oh, come on, don't give me that answer. Yeah. And I'm like, but you have to understand it's the event. It's the event. Who's the kid? What's the kid's genetics? How old are they? So like I have sprinters who train like Tony Holler's kids. Yeah. Train because that's what they're built to do. That's what their genetics inform me that they should do. And then I have kids that train much more like me and that guy, Mike Hurst, and my buddy Sean Burris, who might very well be the best long sprint coach in the world. He's the guy who's coaching Justin Robinson, who was a high schooler as a junior, ran 44.84 in the 400-meter dash, which is world class. Yeah. You know, like very few people run that fast. And he's coached that kid and tons of other kids in other schools around the St. Louis area to those performances. And the key is good coaches, the kids get better underneath them. You know what I'm saying? It's the kids aren't successful in spite of them. So those are things that I found to be common.
Well, man, and there is so much there and good stuff, like really good stuff. So to try and maybe diffuse a little bit of stuff out of there is the one underlying principle throughout all of that is this idea, this SAID principle, this specific adaptation to impose demands, right? Like think about what do you have to do in competition? And then you said work backwards. I always think of the word reverse engineer, right? So we think specifically what are we doing in the event, whether that's, you know, for the predominant, for most of my athletes is football. So many different things that we have to take into consideration. You know, you're living the track world or the distance world. So you're just taking whatever that event is. And then, like you said, we just work backwards and reverse engineer this entire process, come up with meaningful markers of what we're kind of striving for, your KPIs, and then you execute. But another thing that was really cool, and this is, I think the first time I heard Tony Holler talk about his Feed the Cat system, the one thing that I thought was so cool about it was, in my estimation, and it's not 100% right, but the underlying like premise of that whole system is psychology, right? He just is like, I wanted a culture of kids that were fast. So we just never did anything slow. All we ever do is short sprints really fast. And these kids mentally, all they think about is how fast they are. And, you know, from a physiological standpoint, are there other things that, you know, go into that equation? And yeah, like your book, there's 50 people that 49 other coaches had a different strategy for it. But that was the one thing when I first heard him talk about his Feed the Cat system, I was like, man, you know what? That is cool because, you know, being an athlete and having successful performances is so much more than just your physical. It's that mental piece. And you talked about that when you have to go to a state championship and have back-to-back races or back-to-back days and potentially 8 races. Like if you've never done that, put yourself in the athlete's shoes. From an anxiety standpoint, that kid's going to be freaking out. And so to think of all of these factors when you're reverse engineering that plan and coming up with that is so vitally important. And that's why when you hear coaches talk about more than just the X and O's of sets and reps and this and that, that's when you're like, yeah, that, you know, this person's been around the block a little bit. And then for me as a young coach, all I try and do is I find people that are far more ahead than me in terms of experience. And then I just try and harvest out, okay, here's all the mistakes I'm making. If I keep on this path, I'll eventually figure it out. But why don't I just look at all these people that have made all these mistakes and adapted and changed their approach based on their mistakes? And I'll just steal their stuff right now, and then tweak it to fit my athletes, my situation, and my skill set.
Correct. And when you get into that process, eventually you get to a point which I call the 90-5-5-5 plan, which is basically you've got 90% of your program that eventually you feel really comfortable with. It's locked in. There's 5% that you're throwing out, okay, because it didn't work the previous year. So 5% of that's getting thrown out. It's going to the bin. It's in the dumpster. Then there's 5% something new that you're going to try. That you said, man, I really like Tony's philosophy with that. I'm going to try that with this particular group of about 4 or 5 athletes that I have that really fit not only the mentality, but the physicality of what they probably need in the Feed the Cats. And then I have a 5% where I allow myself, even though it's maybe not, because it is, I call it the mystery. So the 5% of the mystery that I'm going to allow myself to be flexible to try in the season as we're moving along, if an issue shows up, or what I would like to say, an opportunity to shows up to benefit you in your program. And so there's things like, oh, I really like that idea. Okay, well, let's try that out with this particular athlete or this particular event. Even though we're now a month into training, I don't feel like it's dangerous to try it out, and I don't feel like I'm going to get diminishing returns. So that's that whole idea of 90, 5, 5, and 5. So you've got the 5% you're chucking out every year to try to get better. You got your 5% that you're going to try out that you learned, and then you got your 5% that allows you the flexibility to the mystery and the challenges and opportunities that the season provides you. And I always think that that's good. Some people are like, oh, you shouldn't cut and paste, or I'm not going to share. Here's the deal. If you meet a coach who's doing really well and they don't want to share from you, that would be the last, or share with you. That's the last time I ever communicate with that coach in that regard, and if they ever came to me, I would probably be pretty hesitant to share back with them, because it's like, look, I came to you for this, and it's this idea of, is it an abundance mindset or a scarcity mindset? I live in a world of abundance. I have all sorts of privilege, not to be all political, but I have privilege. There's a lot of things I've benefited from. So my job is to help as many people, like you just said, not make those monumental mistakes that I made, because you want to always apologize to every kid you've ever had, because as you move forward, you're going to be a better coach.
Yeah.
But you don't want to apologize for ruining their career. It's like, man, I should have had you run the 400, or I should have had you long jump. Not, man, I'm really sorry I tore your ACL.
Yeah.
So we want to minimize those catastrophic mistakes and let you sit on our shoulders so you can see farther down the line of things that you're going to be able to do. And so your percentages of change are going to be so much smaller, because you're going to see the big picture items that you're going to need to see holistically for your athletes. So anybody who's a scarcity mindset coach worries me. And the psychology, like you said, of Tony, it's really important. Like, if your state, which Illinois is set up to win with sprinters and jumpers, short sprinters and jumpers, well, you better train that way.
Yeah.
And you better get the best kids in your building to do it, because if not, we're going to have problems. Yeah. So it's interesting.
Yeah, sorry about that. My dog started barking there. No, it is interesting. And like you said, we talked about how all these factors come into play there. Like you referenced Tony again. Okay, well, geography is also probably dictating. That's why Illinois is built for jumpers and short sprinters, because guess what? Their climate's very similar to what I experience up here in Canada. So they're stuck. A lot of their competitions are probably heavily weighted on indoor stuff. So they're stuck to 60s and long jumps and all these things. So like you said, we're all kind of at the mercy of our geography and our own personal skill sets and our viewpoints. And that's what we're supposed to do as coaches, is to find as much information as we possibly can out there, and then find a way, how does this apply to me and my athletes, my situation?
Yeah, and if you look at Illinois also, their long distance, it's like the Kenya of America. They have produced so many super elite distance athletes. And in fact, their Division III program called North Central, which is in a suburb of Chicago, has won like 30 out of 35 years in a row the cross-country national title.
Really?
So you have Illinois is very bipolar, right? So it's like this idea of You know, we can't go outside and run long, hard intervals because not all of us have an indoor track, you know, so we're going to run short stuff in the hallways. They have an indoor track season, which indoor track is very much geared towards the short things, you know, and then they have a huge cross country season, but you can go out in really awful cold conditions and bundle up and get a lot of the critical work done for endurance running. And so if you look at the Illinois high school distance experience, it's incredible. But like you said, that geography then in those middle or long sprints and middle distance events, that's where it gets funky because you can't really do the things necessary at the high end to attack the biology that you need and the adaptations that you need to make those events fly, you know?
And I think, you know, like everything we're talking about here is, you know, maybe specific right now to Illinois or this, but we want to zoom out and think of it from a principal standpoint. And really all we're trying to outline here is that your strategy is going to be based on so many factors rather than just what is the best one. And so when, you know, this is why when coaches or athletes or whoever asks either myself or you, coach, and says, what's the best strategy? This is why we say it depends. Not because we're lazy and we don't want to give away free information, like you said, that scarcity mindset. It's because, man, what's your situation? What's your experience? What's all this? So I hope that, you know, that conversation there really helped drive home that point. But there's so many different ways to do it. And it's your job as a coach or as an athlete to take the ownership of that process and figure out what's the best one for me and where I'm at right now.
And that's where the line of questioning for the person, if you ever are in a position of being a mentor or an advisor or a special assistant, and they're coming to you for that information, you know, that Socratic method of having a series of questions that you're going to ask them. So you'd say, hey, it all depends. But let me ask you a few questions. You know, what's your training environment like?
They hate that because they're like you said, I just want this simple, easy answer, but this is the way we have to go about it.
Right. And I would say like, hey, like, be patient with me. I'm going to give you stuff, but let's get into some of this, you know, and that's where we have these conversations. And I feel bad sometimes for people who are listening, but it's one of those things where it's like, I can go on and on and on because there's so much that is at play, you know? And so my goal is to go, okay, let's look at the whole thing. Let's ask 10 questions, you know, and then from those 10 questions, all right, now I have somewhat of a scheme, I think, that would work well for you because I'm a master of the classics. I've studied Tony Wells. I've studied Clyde Hart / Sean Burris. I've, you know, really invested a lot of time with Corfist and Tony Holler and their methods and their philosophy. And it's like, all right, now I think I can help answer this question for you. I had a coach ask me like, hey, I got a real problem with my athlete in the 100-meter dash, but, you know, she had run a really good 400, but her 100 looks terrible. And I was like, well, what's her 200 look like? And he's like, well, that's not what I'm asking about. I go, no. I said, that's exactly the answer. Yeah. I said, because if the athlete is really, really fast in the 200, you know, but is also looking good in the 4, it doesn't look good in the 100, then basically what the deal is that the acceleration is a problem. The block starts are a problem. Those might need to be fixed. The training that you're giving them is not addressing that, or that's not the athlete's event.
Yeah.
They might want to run the 100, but they're actually really better when you move them up in this other direction. You know, they're just better at that. You know, they still look good in the blocks. They still look good in acceleration, but this is where they shine. They have some innate abilities, genetically driven, that's going on. And so those are the reasons why these questions and how you ask those questions. And even if you don't have a mentor, for the people that are listening, you need to ask yourself these questions. You know, like, what is my environment? What are my goals? What are my major competitions? What is my athlete population like? You know, what's my facility look like? You know, where have I been successful versus not being successful? Why do I think that is?
Yeah.
You know, and that's important.
Yeah. I was going to say that is a really good addition in terms of that line of question is why do I think that this is? Because a lot of the times, you know, I've maybe experienced some kids and maybe myself where I've felt that, oh, you know, getting my squat up is what helped me be better this season and whatever. And is that true? I don't know, but it's my job as the coach or the athlete to say, well, why do you think that's true? And is it objectively true?
Right. And then
go ahead. All I was just going to say was, I know that's, there's a few and I don't want to say the word controversial because it sounds too exaggerated, but I will use it, controversial topics in terms of speed development. And I would love to hear your opinion on them. And one is the weight room, and another is drills and technique drills and drilling and that kind of stuff. So why don't you kind of maybe elaborate on the your stance on the weight room and the impact that it has in speed development, and where you think it might fit in the picture, and then we can kind of finish off and talk about the drills and that stuff.
Sure. So weight room wise, I am a big proponent of the weight room. I believe the weight room is very, very important, especially for developmental athletes. And I feel like it is a easy way to make improvements, especially early on. The issue is when is enough, yeah. Right? And some of it is with your eyes. If an athlete is getting really, really big and they're not projecting, they're not, that weight becomes a detriment, that's a problem. Your program needs to be balanced, which means you can't have guys, always skipping leg day. You've got to provide them space in the training if you believe that lifting is important for the leg day to have a priority, and it has to fit. The other thing I think people make mistakes with when it comes to weight training is they try to separate it out amongst everything else. So it's like its own thing, and it's not. It's a part of what you're doing. So one of the things that people have to understand is when you're in a heavy training cycle and you're in the track and field season or a competitive season, your weight numbers are probably going to go down. But the projection of that force, your ability to produce power is probably going to go up. But the thing is you're always lifting your weights probably after you're running, or way early in the morning where you're doing like a 2-a-day split, and so, yeah, the testosterone's up in the morning. It's a good time to lift weights and work out. But, you're going to be naturally stiff, sore, or your neurological system's going to be dampened. So that when the weight room isn't the emphasis, unless it's the sport itself, if weightlifting is the sport itself, it's going to have dips in performance. But those dips in performance are because of other global improvements and other things that you're doing that are being emphasized.
Yeah.
Right? So all that stuff. And then how you construct the weight room is so important too. Like, what are your phases going to look like? So for me, I have what's called a posture buttressing, which is basically general strength, but we'll do that as our first phase. Then we'll do hypertrophy. And some people are like, oh, I never would do hypertrophy. But you have to remember, I'm working with high school kids. So what am I trying to do? I'm trying to teach technique. I'm also trying to improve joints and joint stability, right? And I'm trying to give the body a chance to build up the tendons and ligaments so that they can support the work that I'm doing later. Also, if you look at a funny car, all funny cars that are dragsters, right, that are in the Top Fuel Roadster series, they all have big back tires.
Yeah.
So you got to create a little bit of a cross section of the muscle and make it a little bit bigger to improve leverage, which some people don't even think about. But the construction of the muscle and the way the muscle is actually improves leverage, so that you can exert more force.
Yeah.
All right. You got to make the tires a little bit bigger for some of those kids that look like they're, wet rats. You got to get them a little bit bigger. And again, it's all, this is all a balance. Yeah. Then we move from there. Then we move to our maximal phase. Okay. So now we're lifting heavy reps, very few sets, very few reps, but very heavy. Then from there, I'll do a proprioceptive lift where they're doing single legs, unilateral stuff, not bilateral stuff. Then we'll do what's called the fastest possible series, which is velocity-based training. But again, I'm a hillbilly redneck. I don't have tendo units and all that kind of stuff. So instead of worrying about what this machine says on the end of the bar, we get a stopwatch out, and then everybody in the rack has a trio. So one person's lifting, one person's spotting, one person's timing. And then the goal is not so much moving the weight up, it's moving the weight really, really, really fast. And the goal is, how long does it take you to complete the set? The faster you can go, the better. And then the last is a ballistic series where we do a lot of the French contrasting methods and we throw a lot of medicine balls. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to constantly move that athlete to keep adapting and adapting to the things you want them to do at the most critical time. And then some people go, oh, well then you're never going fast. It's like, no, that's not what I'm doing. You have to remember that each one of these series is like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And then I have 2 to 3 peaks a year. So if I have kids training with me all winter long, they see that stuff right at the very beginning before the season starts again. Okay? So they're peaking, and I'm putting all that stuff in the last 3 to 6 weeks in phases, and then I'm doing those 3 to 6 week phases again in the regular season, and then they get it again. And then if they do summer track, same thing.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that a lot of coaches mess up, strength and conditioning coaches, no offense, Andrew.
No.
But is one of the things is they overemphasize the strength and they underemphasize the conditioning. What it really should be is it should be speed, strength, suppleness. That's the way it should go. Because guess what? That's what it looks like in your practice. You're doing speed typically first, strength then, and then you probably cool down with some sort of suppleness training, foam rolling, static stretching, yoga, or whatever. Yeah. And so that's a thing. Then what workouts you do in the weight room are so important. So for me, all my athletes, every one of them, even my 2-milers, power clean, okay? Or they'll do a variation of Olympic lift. They deadlift, they bench, they squat. Every one of them. Why? Because that calls upon the most motor units. Yep. And if you're doing all of that stuff and you don't have an experience in some of the ancillary lifts and the Swiss stability ball and Boso balls and med balls, then you've got a good base, which I would say would cover you like 80% of the things an athlete needs to do strength-wise.
Yeah.
It's going to improve posture. It's going to improve the ability to produce force very much through all those motor units simultaneously. And we always make sure that our Olympic lift is going to be first. And the reason why is when you come to the weight room, when you walk in, that's probably the most neurologically fresh you're going to be. So don't Olympic lift after you've bench, squatted, and deadlift. That needs to be the first thing you do, or some kind of variation of that.
Yep.
And so then once my athletes get those 4 or 5 lifts together, then the specificity of their training comes in. Then I will target with the ancillary work the other things they need to do. And in the regular season, I'm probably only going to lift 2 or 3 times a week because I just don't have time for it. And it's not as important as sprinting, jumping. Those are more important, so it becomes a background thing. But then in the off season and cross country, my girls, every day they show up, they lift. In the winter, we lift 4 out of 4 days that I train them, because the one thing you can guarantee, and especially for your listeners in Canada, is it's pretty much going to be 72 degrees and humid in the weight room every time. So it is the one totally guaranteed thing. So in those parts of the year, the summer and the winter, we're doing a lot more of that outside of my cross country or football, which is the 2 sports I used to coach in the fall. I still coach cross country, or in track. Then the weight room becomes less because it's not so much about the maximal effort of that lift. It's more about power production and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's my philosophy. And then when people hear weight room, back in the day in the 1960s, they wouldn't let athletes lift. They're like, oh, you'll be too immobile, you'll be too tight. Well, that's just not the case. No. It's all about what you're doing, how you construct it, when you emphasize it, and how you phase it out with all that stuff.
I would just to compound on that.
Go ahead.
It's also how you're executing those movements, right? Like that's the thing. People get these negative connotations with lifting weights and training and resistance training and all this stuff. It's like, man, the only people that are getting those, are having the negative consequences from training, like, are the people that are doing it wrong. Like,
correct.
Form is a big thing. Everyone wants to talk about mobility because it's like cool and sexy in this decade, and that'll probably change in a few years because things come in phases. They come and go, right? But it's a really good mobility exercise, really good like a full range of motion squat with good technique, right? Talk about active range of motion and control through range of motion and all that. That's a great mobility exercise. People just aren't willing to look at that way, and most of the time it's because they're doing it wrong, why they're getting these negative consequences.
Yeah, ask them to do an overhead squat with just the bar.
Yeah.
And you're going to find out how immobile most of the populations that we work with are. And just that right there. And that's what people always forget. It's also passive stretching. Yeah. You know, so they think about mobilization, but it's like, but now you can move through those ranges of motion so much better, you know, when you're doing things properly, that it improves globally so many other things besides just the bro stuff of being a big dude like I wanted to be. Over, you know, my goal of being over 200 pounds, that was a big deal to me, you know, and it's like, great. But like a deadlift, if you've got a deadlift bar and you're doing a Romanian deadlift, right, straight leg, kind of flat back, Romanian deadlift, and you put yourself up on some bumper plates, and now you're going real deep all the way to the ankles with the Olympic bar. Well, not only are you getting stronger in your posterior, that's making you way more mobile, especially if you're doing it right. Yeah. You know, so yeah, you're completely correct on that.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I see people get screwed up. And really what you just explained with that whole process of walking us through your viewpoint on weight training is that whole reverse engineering process. And you're just saying, okay, well, here's the qualities that are important for their competition. So we're going to make sure we're peaking those as they get into their competition season. And when we're furthest away from their competition season, we're going to do the least specific things. And then it's just a phasic thing that just unrolls. So before we get off the horn here, we do have a little bit longer here before I got a jet, but I would love to hear your viewpoints on the sprint drills. I know like you said, there's people that live in these camps, and no matter what strategy these people might use to actually develop speed, you'll see some people that will tell you doing sprint drills, drilling that technique is an absolute waste of time. Or you'll have other people that live and die with it. And then again, you'll have people that are somewhere in between. So where do you stand on all this stuff? And if you do implement it with your athletes, how do you go about doing that?
I'm the big bang of drills. So what do I mean by that is I am the alpha and the omega of it. And what I mean by that is simply they are incredibly important. And just what we talked about before, it's like, is it going to visually show up in shapes? Maybe not. But what ends up happening is those shapes become easier to produce in movement.
Yeah.
Because of drills. It requires less energy to do it. Your firing patterns are improved so that they're coming in a more coordinated fashion. The small articulations of muscles in certain joints and in certain movements that never get stimulated through drills. You're less likely to get injured. You're more mobile. And the other thing that people are so unaware of is this very simple principle. You can become more supple day to day. You can improve your endurance week to week. You can improve your power month to month. You can improve your speed year to year, and you can improve your grittiness decade to decade. So the first thing that you can improve and something that you can really fix right away is your ability to move. And yeah, doing a rocket, where you're bouncing off single contact and switching midair and not doing 2 feet to the ground type of drill, you're like, well, I'll never do that in track and field. That's not going to improve me. But what it does is it improves the muscles that are popping off the ground in that posterior chain to take that load as a rubber band, distribute the force and stress, and then respond and push your center of mass forward. So yeah, you're not going to run like that, but it's going to provide you protection and a firewall to injuries, And then over time, what people seem to forget is if you think speed takes year to year, the reason why speed takes year to year is that it's very neurologically driven. What does that tell you? Neurology takes a long time to wire. So yeah, you might not see improvements from doing these drills all the time in the first 2 weeks that you're working with your athlete. But by the time they graduate, if you're doing the alpha and the omega like I am, where I'm doing a lot of drills and I'm running 2 different packages of drills and I'm doing 6 phases of drills a year that are built on the previous ones, and I'm very, very anal about how those drills are being performed. It's not my, time to sit around and talk with you, Andrew, about what happened at school that day. It's my time to watch and take a look at the athlete. Very important. Not only for eventually what I'm going to get 500 hours later, which is a better shaped athlete, more technically efficient, more timed, improved firing patterns, which by the way happens. That's why we're doing it. Myelin wraps around these neurons and creates a stronger signal, a more accurate signal, and a faster signal. So if you're not doing that stuff and then you're asking the athlete to produce parts of it or a whole, they're never going to be able to put it together. Then the other part of it is You can pick out where they have those weaknesses, stiffnesses, immobile things, and opportunities for skill sets to improve. You can also use it as a diagnostic tool at the beginning of practice to catch injuries before they become catastrophic, right? Where a kid's showing like they're stiff or they're not popping off the ground or they're grimacing or they're showing one movement on one side of the body has asymmetry where it wasn't before.
Yeah.
You know, and these type of things, and that's where people just, they don't understand. So like when a coach comes to me and says, I get done with my practice in 45 minutes, good, good for you. I can't afford to do that. I don't have an indoor track. I've got to use these drills as also the warm-up to get those the mechanoreceptors to fire and to get the body in what I call a slow cooked state. I want to slow cook the meat, but I also want to improve technique. And I also want to be diagnostic before we get injuries. I want to improve muscles. I want to improve firing patterns. I want to improve connective tissue. All of that comes from drills, and it allows you to actually coach. You know, that's one of the places where we can actually make a difference as a track and field coach, and it takes time. I had a young lady who ended up being the fastest girl in the state of the 800 meters. She was really, really fast when she was a freshman, but she moved like crap. Horrible mover, horrible shapes, skitter-scatted like a little like, you know, creature running around my backyard, you know, it just didn't look good. But the watch said she was real good. But my eyes told me something different. So because of the stuff that we did over time, by the time she was gone, she was very coordinated, had a nice, monstrous open stride, popped off the ground really great, you know, and was the fastest girl in the state of Missouri in the 800. So it doesn't just help sprinters where those movements have the most amplitude, right? Mm-hmm. Which is where you see those extreme movements because they're moving so fast and they're covering so much ground and their stride length is so big. You know, and the other thing everybody's got to remember is that stride length, that can be improved quicker than the stride frequency. Stride frequency, also a neurological pursuit, takes a really long time. So that's where when somebody is an absolutist about one of what I would call a unit in training. So you've got your general warm-up, suppleness, biomechanics, energy system development, plyometrics, cool down, weight room, right? And then you got your sports psych that is in there typically either at the beginning or the end, depending on your philosophy. Okay? If you're minimizing or completely ignoring one of those things, then the puzzle is never going to be completely put together. And you might have your reasons that you're like, I just want half this puzzle because I only like this part of the picture anyway. I don't need the rest of it. Well, that's fine, but they're never going to be the complete athlete that you want. And so for me, the biggest part of my practice, the longest part of my practice is our warm-up, our suppleness, and our drills, because that's what allows us to then do all the fun stuff of running and jumping and competing for, you know, track and field.
No, that's great. And I asked that as a loaded question. I know that you're a big proponent of the drills, and I just wanted to hear you unload and talk about that, and that was great. And the way I've always looked at drills, and whether that's even like again coming from a football background, even the drills that the coaches had us do, or when I was coaching football, the drills I had my athletes do, or the sprint drills that we just discussed. What a drill is just take something that you're going to see in competition or sport and exaggerate it. Right? You want to, like, most of the time, slow it down and exaggerate either the position, the movement, what have you. And that's what a drill really is. Again, because when we get into the chaos that is performance, whether that's a race or whether that's a play, we want you to have some sort of reference point. And like you said, if you can accumulate time and hours in these positions or doing these things in a slower, more controlled sense where you can really engage and talk and coach and teach, well, then you have a better pool to draw from when you do get thrown to the fire and you do get out in the chaos there. So that's how I've always looked at it. That's definitely something that I've already learned from you in the short time that we've worked, that I've kind of known you about everything that you talk about is the two packages that you have and the progression built in without that, I think that's just awesome. And I think a lot of the times when it even does come to drills, even if it's a coach that does incorporate them into their training or their sessions, they come up with one set of drills and they do that all year. Oh, we're just going to do A's, butt kicks, this, pogos, blah, 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 whatever it might be. And they come up with one, and everything is 2 sets of 15 yards, and it never changes. It never progresses. And I can say this because I've been that guy, and I'm still not perfect at it. But like you said, as a coach and as an athlete, or wherever you're at in your journey, you're just trying to look at what's holding me back and how can I address things and learn and improve. And so, I reach out to Coach Banta, and I know he's got a really good system for how he does drills. And I learned a ton from you, but that's one of the things that I'll definitely take, because I know at some point in my career, I was just that, all right, I'm going to put these 4 together, 2 by 10, we'll do them every day. And that is just from a lack of experience. And this is what I'm saying, that as a young coach, like, this is why I love engaging with guys like yourself, is so I can really kind of get a few steps ahead instead of learning it all the hard way.
Right. Well, exactly. And the biggest thing is think about your experience as an athlete yourself.
Yeah.
Do you want to do the same thing over every day, all the time? That even if it's not hard, and even if you're getting out of practice in 45 minutes, that's really boring, and it becomes drudgery. And the body knows that too. Our body is so smart. Do you want to program the computer with the same code all the time? If you do that, you're not going to have this very highly adaptable system that can be very productive in a lot of different ways. And if you think about the idea of detraining and this idea of an athlete becoming docile, like if you're doing those same things all the time, then they're just going to start going through the motions.
Yeah.
Technique is going to fail. They're going to get bored. The body is certainly going to not be stimulated by that. It's not going to learn. It's not going to be forced to adapt. And so that's how people need to understand that that's a rule, that if you're a coach, your training has to go in a direction. Mm-hmm. And it has to go in a direction based on your previous work. You're building something to crescendo to something else that is whatever that may be. And you have to do that. So even though it's like, man, I really like this drill, great. But is there a way that you can do that drill and add a twist to it, or combine it with another drill or another skill that makes it more challenging neurologically, interesting, and the biggest thing, improve your athlete when it matters the most?
Exactly.
Because people see, like, they were like, well, if it's really good, like if I can run flying 20s all the time, then I'm just going to run flying 20s for 6 months. Cool. But at some point, that's not going to stimulate the body. So you've got to figure out a way of either adding a weighted vest, lengthening it, adding time in between, adding some sort of external stimulus like music, whatever, changing from spikes, running on the grass. There's got to be something that moves it.
Yeah.
Because the athlete is going to plateau at some point, and you're going to get diminishing returns. And that's that whole idea of periodization that people don't respect enough. It doesn't have to be these great, beautiful, multicolored charts, but your training has to take the somewhere.
Yep. Yeah. The big charts, they look super cool, but if they're not moving the needle in the way you want, then it's just a big ass waste of time.
100%.
Before we jet here, Coach, I got a few kind of quicker, direct to the point questions, and then I'll give you a chance to let people know where they can get in contact with you, and then we'll go on our way. So what are some of the favorite books or podcasts that you yourself check out?
I hate to say it because it's such a basic answer, but I listen to Joe Rogan all the time.
Oh, everyone does.
I know that doesn't have any, I know it doesn't. Yeah, and it doesn't have anything to really do with track and field per se, but it's just forcing me to expand my mind and to have like really interesting, nuanced, which is one of the words he uses all the time, conversations with people, which has really influenced me to go outside of my area of expertise and find people that are really high-end achievers and other stuff. He's a comedian, and obviously Joe Rogan, when he dies, is probably not going to be known as a comedian moving forward. He's going to be known as being this ultimate podcast guy. But comedy is so important because it is such a master's class of human communication. So I spend a lot of time listening to comedians, not just because they make me laugh, but they challenge my viewpoints of the world. And also they make you better at comedy yourself, which is one of the best ways to create a bond and vibe with someone, is having a good sense of humor that they can attach to and they like. Yeah. And just the way you present language and the way that you say things to make people smile and laugh is so important. I love listening to anything that Altus puts together. I'm a part of this group right now on Facebook called the Coaches Collab Group, where they do 3-hour multi-talks with like 100+ coaches. So if you're on Facebook, look that up if you're a track and field person. Book-wise for me and things that have really been influential for me, The Talent is Overrated, The Talent Code, The Gold Mine Effect. I want to find high achievers, and I want to know what common characteristics that all these high achievers have. A book for me was really good that I read recently in the last year and a half is a book called The Culture Code, and then Legacy, which is about building champions and building really high performance. Yeah, Andrew's got it in the room. That's awesome.
I got Legacy right here on my Kindle. But that's amazing, Coach, and thank you for sharing that stuff there.
Yeah.
This is episode number 12, and 11 of the people I've asked that question have said they listen to Joe Rogan as well. So a very popular guy. Okay, got a couple more for you here.
Sure.
What is, if you had to just very quick point blank say 1 to 2 of the biggest mistakes that you see high school athletes making, what are those?
High school athletes they watch too much Instagram and YouTube for their answers. They're obsessed with toys. They're not they're more willing to pay $1,000 to train with somebody for a month because they have a Vertimax and not get any better, or to work on the one thing that they don't need to work on and throw away their season. The other mistake is that if somebody's willing to work with you for free versus asking you to pay them, just because they ask you to pay them doesn't mean they're any more valuable than the person who wants to work with you for free. And that's not always true. I can tell you that psychologically I've seen that. Yeah. I've seen that. The other thing is that athletes need to understand is the coach plays a role, but the athlete themselves are the most important. Why? Because we only monitor about 2 hours of your day. The 22 other hours of the day is on you. So if you spend the rest of your days screwing everything up, then in the 2 hours, we're basically playing catch up the entire time I spend with you, or we're just flying the plane, holding on to the duct tape, hoping the wings don't fall off.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Okay, and the last one here is who's a guest that I should try and get on my podcast here?
Oh, gosh. Well, a Missouri guy is Sean O'Connor. He's won numerous state titles in cross country and in distance running, and has had nationally ranked distance runners. He's amazing. Nick Buckvar or Coach Burris are pretty much the masters of the long sprint training. You could get them on. They're very interesting guys with a bunch of perspective. And Burris is probably the best sprint coach in the country. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it isn't. He just hasn't coached professionals yet.
Yeah.
They're really good. And if you could ever get Dan Path on, Boo Schneider, or Curtis Taylor, who's out in Oregon. He's the Oregon sprint coach. If you could catch one of those guys, it would be great. Vince Anderson's another one. So those are all good people you should probably think about trying to reach out.
Yeah, and definitely there's some hierarchy there. Like I'm really looking forward to hear Coach Path present next week. I signed up for the Altus virtual ACP, so I'm really excited for that. And you yourself is a former presenter at one of the ACPs, no?
Yeah, I presented a few years ago after I completed the Sprinters Compendium, and we were talking about those buckets that all those coaches were in, and just trying to get some hemispheres, with them. And Dan is an amazing guy. He's actually funnier in person than he is in his online, so to speak, image or whatever it is. And not that he's not funny, but he's really funny in person.
I'm looking forward to it.
Really. Yeah, they're really great. So the Altus guys, for every listener that's here, that's a thing you need to do. Yeah. It's part of your Hajj, if you will. It's part of your pilgrimage. If they're still around and you're still coaching, at some point you guys need to go down there, because I've never seen a group do everything that I would love to do if I had all the resources in the world and connections. They're about as close to you could get, and they have the right philosophy of an abundance mindset and all that kind of stuff that you want to see from coaches.
Yeah, no, those guys are awesome, and I'm pumped to support them and their little project that they got going on here, donating all the profits from that to a good cause, and also to be able to learn from them. So, Ray, we're about to sign off here. I got to go coach. Thankfully, I'm happy to be able to do that again. If people wanted to get in contact with you, check you out, where could they do that? Social, websites, whatever.
So social media, I'm very active on Twitter. So you can find me at Sprinters Compend there. So if you just start typing in Sprinters Compendium, I'll come up. My YouTube page is Bantasmo 1978. You can also search for Sprinters Compendium. I have hundreds and hundreds of hours of talks on there, and a lot of my presentations I've done at clinics. I'm maxed out on Facebook, but you can follow me on Facebook, but I have the 5,000 limit. And then my Instagram is Ryan.Banta. So anywhere there. And then if you want the Sprinters Compendium, it's sold worldwide on Amazon.com, both in Kindle and in paperback.
Yeah, and I'll throw links to all your contact info, the Sprinters Compendium, all of that. I'll throw that in the bio there. But Coach, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and coming on here and sharing your wisdom with all of us. It was a really great time, and I super appreciate it.
Andrew, I appreciate it, man. And hopefully this has helped people, and feel free to reach out. That's why we're here, guys. You know, we want to be able to help and answer questions and, you know, challenge ideas and all that kind of stuff. That's what it's about, is growing all coaches, because rising tide raises all ships.
There you go.